Before we begin, let me make one thing clear. This isn't the movie with glittering chandeliers and a modern soundtrack. There is no Kirsten Dunst running through the halls of Versailles, and no cake waiting in the garden. What we're about to share is quieter, slower, and much more real. Tonight I invite you to travel with me to the last days of Marie Antoinette, not the queen from the stories, but the woman who once stood beneath the same sky you do now, breathing, hoping, and fearing as any of us might. Welcome, dear listener. I'm truly glad you've chosen to spend these minutes here. Perhaps you are resting after a long day. Perhaps the world outside has grown too loud and you simply need a moment to drift back into history. Wherever you are, make yourself comfortable. Close your eyes if you wish, and let your imagination open a door to another century. The room is dim, the candlelight soft, and the walls of Versailles are holding their breath. For a long time, she has been remembered through rumors, portraits, and famous lines that she never actually said. But beneath the gossip and the grandeur, there was a young woman carried into a foreign court at 14, taught to smile perfectly, and slowly forgotten by the world that once adored her. In the final months of her life, all that remained of the queen were her memories, her letters, and the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to face the end with grace. As we move together through her last nights, I invite you not just to listen, but to feel. Let the sounds of the palace return, the whisper of silk, the faint creak of the floor, the distant hum of a Paris changing forever. Breathe in, slowly. The air is heavy with perfume and candle smoke, but somewhere behind it there is the scent of rain and the echo of voices that once filled these endless corridors. If you enjoy traveling through history in this calm and gentle way, I'd love for you to join this little community of dreamers. Subscribe, leave a note in the comments, or simply share where and when you're listening from. Every story here's a small light in the night, and together we make the past a little warmer. Now, as the candles flicker and the world of the present begins to fade, let us walk together into Versailles. Not the palace of luxury, but the one of memory, reflection, and the soft heartbeat of time itself. The palace still breathed as if nothing could touch it. Each morning unfolded with the same perfect rhythm, polished by years of ritual and repetition. In the great corridors, candlelight glided over gold-framed mirrors, catching the shimmer of faded silk and dust. The marble floors held a quiet chill, and the air carried the scent of roses long past their bloom, mixed with wax and memory. Versailles had always been a world of symmetry, a place where even silence seemed rehearsed. Servants moved like phantoms, their steps measured, their voices low, as though afraid to disturb the weight of habit. Outside, autumn clouds gathered, slow and gray, pressing against the horizon. Inside, the clocks ticked in perfect time, unaware that the rhythm of the world beyond those gates had already begun to change. Somewhere deep in the palace, a door closed softly. The sound was small, almost polite, yet it seemed to echo longer than it should have. Perhaps the walls, after so many years of music and laughter, were learning how to hold a different kind of sound. The sound of uncertainty. To walk through Versailles in those days was to wander through a dream that was slowly losing its shape. The grand mirrors no longer reflected pride but fatigue. The chandeliers still sparkled, yet their light felt thinner, stretched across rooms that once overflowed with celebration. Even the gardens, perfect in their geometry, looked like they were waiting for something or someone to break the spell. History often speaks of revolutions as sudden storms, but inside the palace it began as a whisper, a distant murmur from the city, a few raised voices at the markets, a tremor too small to name. And yet, behind the perfume and the etiquette, a question had begun to form, quiet but persistent. How long could this fragile perfection endure? In that soft uncertainty, Versailles held its breath, unaware that its golden silence would soon give way to the sound of marching feet and the turning of a new century. In a quiet chamber overlooking the gardens, Marie Antoinette sat by the window, her reflection framed in the pale morning light. The once bustling world around her had softened into something smaller, slower, and more fragile. The queen who had once embodied elegance and extravagance now moved with a kind of deliberate calm, as though every gesture had been weighed and measured against the silence that surrounded her. There was still grace in her posture, but it no longer came from the training of court life. It came from endurance. Her hands, once decorated with jewels, rested bare upon her lap, fingers tracing invisible patterns, perhaps memories of music, perhaps the rhythm of her own thoughts. Beyond the window, the fountains of Versailles still sang faintly, but the beauty felt distant, like a melody remembered from another lifetime. To the courtiers, she remained her majesty. To the people, she had become a symbol too distant to love, too visible to forget. Yet beneath the powdered hair and the formal titles was a woman who had learned what it meant to be seen and misunderstood at the same time. She was both adored and blamed, the living embodiment of a world that was cracking beneath its own weight. There were days when she received letters from her children, carefully folded, written in a hand that trembled with innocence. She would read them in silence, her eyes softening, her voice never rising. In those moments, the queen disappeared, and only a mother remained. It was in those small, private spaces, the act of reading, the slow closing of her eyes, that her humanity returned. Quiet and unadorned. The courtyards outside no longer echoed with music or laughter. The king walked less often through the halls, his steps slower, heavier, lost in thought, and Marie, sensing the change more deeply than anyone, began to retreat inward. Her stillness was not apathy. It was a kind of listening. She could hear the distant hum of something vast and unstoppable, the murmur of a country that no longer dreamed in gold. If you had seen her then, you might not have recognized the infamous queen of the pamphlets and the parrot. Her eyes, once bright with curiosity, now carried the weight of unsaid things. Yet even in that stillness, there was a faint dignity, the calm of someone who, perhaps without knowing it, was already preparing to face history, not as a ruler, but as a witness to her own ending. By the time the first whispers reached Versailles, the air itself seemed different. It was no longer the perfume of lilies and powder that drifted through the halls, but the faint, metallic scent of unease. The servants moved more quickly now, their glances sharper, their silences longer. Something invisible had entered the palace. Not a person, but a feeling, and it spread quietly from corridor to corridor, like smoke seeping under a locked door. Marie Antoinette sensed it, before most did. At dinners, conversations faltered where once they had sparkled. Courtiers who had built their lives around flattery began to measure their words. The laughter that once filled the salons came in shorter bursts, forced, echoing awkwardly against the gilded ceilings. Even the music had changed. It seemed to carry a tremor, as if the violins themselves were aware that the notes would soon be silenced. Outside the gates, Paris was no longer the same. The city pulsed with restless energy gatherings and taverns, murmured speeches, printed pamphlets passed from hand to trembling hand. The world that had worshipped Versailles was turning away from it, and the distance between the palace and the people grew larger with every passing night. From her balcony, the queen sometimes watched the horizon. Beyond the manicured gardens and fountains lay the faint glow of the city. Not the soft glow of candlelight, but the restless shimmer of fires and movement. She didn't yet know what those lights meant, but she could feel them calling, a rhythm out of sync with the calm of the court. Inside, advisors came and went, carrying half-truths disguised as reassurance. The people only need time, they said. The unrest will fade. But in the quiet between their words, Marie could hear something truer, the sound of footsteps, gathering far beyond the palace walls. There were still balls and ceremonies, still polished silver and orchestras, but they had become performances of denial. The chandeliers burned brighter, the dresses shimmered more vividly, as if beauty itself could push back the inevitable. And yet, beneath every polite smile, a shadow lingered, the knowledge that something sacred and centuries old was beginning to fracture. That night, as the last candles flickered and the great rooms fell into silence, a storm rolled in from the west. The rain struck the windows in steady rhythm, like hands knocking on a door that could no longer remain closed. Inside, Versailles slept uneasily, unaware that the world outside was already awake. The morning the crowd arrived. The sky was a low, heavy gray. Versailles, that glittering heart of ceremony and illusion, awoke to the sound of something it had never heard before. Not music, not applause, but the rhythmic roar of thousands of feet and voices. The great palace that had ruled over France with distance and polish suddenly found itself surrounded by the raw breath of the people it had long ignored. Marie Antoinette stood by the window again, though this time there was no reflection to admire, only the blur of movement far beyond the gates. The noise rose and fell like the tide. Shouts, drums, the clatter of wagons, the cries of hunger and rage. For years she had been accused of being out of touch, but nothing could have prepared her for the sound of reality arriving at her doorstep. When the doors were forced open and the court began to crumble, it did so not with the dignity of history books, but with confusion and disbelief. Silk-met mud nobles fled through servants' passages. The grand mirrors that once reflected dances and laughter now showed fear. Versailles had been built to keep the world out, but now the world was inside. Wild and unstoppable. The king's advisors whispered frantic plans, escape routes, negotiations, empty promises while outside. The rain mixed with the shouts of the mob. Marie's children were gathered close to her, their small hands clutching the folds of her dress. In that moment, she was no longer a queen or a symbol. She was simply a mother, standing at the edge of the world she had known all her life. When the order came to leave for Paris, the palace seemed to exhale for the last time. The royal carriages rolled slowly through the gates, escorted by the very people who had once bowed before them. The journey was long and bitter. From the windows, Marie watched the countryside pass in silence, villages where faces stared without emotion, fields that had been stripped bare. Every turn of the wheel felt like a descent, not just from Versailles to Paris, but from power to powerlessness. In the city, the welcome was not one of adoration but of accusation. The streets were narrow, loud, alive with voices that did not cheer but demanded. The Tuileries Palace, where the family would now live, felt like a gilded prison, its beauty cold, its silence menacing. That night, when the doors were locked and the noise of the crowd faded into the distance, Marie Antoinette sat in the dim light, her children asleep beside her. She touched the curtain fabric, fine but unfamiliar, and understood that nothing about her life would ever return to what it had been. The queen, who had once ruled over the grandest court in Europe, now listened to the echo of the city. Outside a heartbeat, stronger than any crown. The Tuileries Palace, though vast and ornamented, did not feel like a home. Its walls seemed to listen. Every whisper of silk, every sigh from a passing guard echoed through its corridors with unnerving clarity. The royal family was no longer surrounded by courtiers and musicians, but by soldiers and suspicion. The gilded ceilings remained, but the air beneath them had changed. It smelled not of perfume and candle smoke, but of damp stone and caution. Marie Antoinette adapted in silence. Her world had narrowed to a few rooms and the faces of her children. She wrote letters when she could, careful and coded, trusting that words might travel where she could not. Her pen moved with restraint, her sentences wrapped in politeness, but between the lines, a quiet despair began to grow. Her handwriting remained elegant, though her hands sometimes trembled. Each day followed the same rhythm. The sound of keys turning in locks, the shuffle of guards outside her door, the clatter of dishes brought and taken away. Evenings were the hardest. When the city quieted, she could hear the faint hum of Paris beyond the gate's laughter. Footsteps, the pulse of a world that had moved on without her. The king grew heavier with worry. He read the papers that mocked them, tried to believe that diplomacy could mend what fury had already torn apart. Marie watched him with a tenderness sharpened by pity. The man once called His Majesty now struggled with simple questions, his voice trailing off into uncertainty. Sometimes they spoke of their children's futures. Other times they sat in silence, to ghosts sharing the same fading candle. In those moments, Marie found refuge in routine. She brushed her daughter's hair slowly each night, humming songs from her own childhood in Austria, songs that carried her mind back to simpler times, two gardens where the world had still seemed kind. Her son asked why the guards always frowned. She told him they were simply tired. He accepted that answer, though she knew it was a lie meant for both of them. When she looked out through the barred windows, Paris no longer appeared as a city of lights and theaters. It was a sea of restless lives, bound together by hunger and anger. And yet, somewhere deep within her, Marie understood the inevitability of it all. She had been raised to believe that kingdoms were eternal, that crowns carried divine weight, but here, confined and watched, she saw the truth, that power once broken does not crumble loudly. It fades breath by breath into silence. At night, when the guards changed and the last light in the corridor flickered, she would whisper a short prayer, not for rescue but for peace. The queen had become a prisoner, and the prisoner had begun to understand the people who kept her there. The cell was small and damp, lit by a single candle that struggled to hold its flame against the draft creeping through the cracks in the stone. The walls sweated with the chill of October, and the faint drip of water from the ceiling marked time more faithfully than any clock. It was here, in the conciergerie, that Marie Antoinette spent her final nights, no longer a queen, not even a prisoner of state, but a number on a list, a woman awaiting judgment that had already been decided. The silence of the prison was not complete. It was stitched with the sounds of life elsewhere. The steps of guards, the scrape of boots on stone, the occasional murmur of a prayer from another cell. She slept little. Her bed was narrow, her blanket thin, but it was not discomfort that kept her awake. It was the strange stillness of acceptance, the quiet clarity that comes when everything that can be taken has already been taken. She wrote one last letter, her testament to heaven. There was no bitterness in her words, only a gentle resignation and an aching concern for her children. Her handwriting, once graceful and assured, wavered slightly, yet the sentences flowed with a calm that startled even those who would later read it. She forgave her enemies, prayed for mercy, and signed her name not as the Queen, but simply Marie Antoinette. The guards who watched her had expected vanity or rage, but what they saw instead was something softer. A woman who moved quietly, who thanked them when they brought her water, who sometimes smiled faintly as though remembering a song no one else could hear. They began to lower their voices around her, uneasy in the presence of someone who carried dignity even in ruin. Outside, the city did not sleep. The revolution was devouring itself, and each sunrise brought new arrests, new rumors, new names. Whispered with fear, the river below the prison flowed black and indifferent, carrying away whatever the guillotine left behind. But in her cell, Marie did not think of politics or vengeance. Her world had shrunk to the width of her walls and the slow flicker of her candle. Sometimes she would stand and place her hand against the stone, feeling its coldness seep into her skin. It reminded her that she was still alive. She would close her eyes and picture her children, the sound of their laughter, the warmth of their small hands. In those brief moments, she could almost believe she was home again. Back in the gardens of Versailles, sunlight pouring through the trees. On the last night, she whispered a prayer and then remained still. Her face turned toward the faint light seeping in from the corridor. There was no crown, no court, no ceremony, only the quiet strength of someone who had learned that, even in the darkest cell, a person can choose the manner of their grace. In the hours between night and dawn, memory became her only freedom. Marie Antoinette drifted through her past, not as a queen, but as a quiet observer of her own life, retracing the fragile thread that had led her to this stillness. The cell around her disappeared when she closed her eyes. In its place came the soft colors of childhood, the gardens of Schönbrunn, the sound of her mother's voice, the rhythm of carriage wheels over cobblestones in Vienna. She remembered laughter before duty, curiosity before protocol. She had once been the 15th child of an empress, a girl who sang, who loved animals, who danced without the burden of a nation on her shoulders. Back then, the world had seemed simple, made of music, letters, and the expectation that kindness would be met with kindness. Her mind wandered to the day she left Austria, crossing the border where everything familiar was stripped away. Her clothes, her language, her name. She became a symbol before she ever became a woman, molded to fit a court that valued spectacle over sincerity. And yet, for all its gold and ceremony, she had tried to live with warmth, to find small joys within the performance. Laughter with her children, secret walks in the gardens, the rare moments when she could simply be Marie. As memory unfolded, it did not come with bitterness, but with a kind of fragile gratitude. She thought of those who had loved her despite everything. Her friends who had remained loyal, her husband who, for all his indecision, had shared her final path with quiet dignity. She thought, too, of the people outside, those who shouted her name in anger. Somewhere, deep within, she understood that their rage was born from hunger and pain, not cruelty alone. The memories shifted again, this time to the small domestic rituals that once defined her days. The sound of fabric being laced, the scent of ink on parchment, the weight of her son's head resting against her shoulder. Each recollection arrived like a ghost, made of light, impossible to touch, yet too vivid to ignore. There was sorrow, yes, but not regret. She had lived within the confines of her role, trapped by expectations older than herself. Now, at the end, she could see it for what it was, not punishment, but release. The crown had been heavy from the start. Only in losing it did she begin to understand its weight. As the first light of morning filtered through the narrow window, she felt something close to peace. The past, with all its grandeur and mistakes, no longer accused her. It simply was. A collection of moments, some gentle, some sharp, all fleeting. She realized that even when everything else had been taken, her freedom, her status, her name, memory remained, patient and merciful, carrying her like a quiet tide toward whatever waited beyond the dawn. The day began with an unfamiliar kind of light, pale, thin, almost reluctant to touch the stone walls of the cell. The city outside was already awake, the sound of carts rolling over the cobblestones, the distant rhythm of footsteps gathering in the streets. For Marie Antoinette, there was no illusion left, no lingering question. The final morning had arrived, as ordinary in its beginning as any other, and yet set apart by the quiet certainty of what it would bring. She dressed without assistance. Her hands, though unsteady, moved with care. The gown she wore was plain linen, white and unadorned. The woman who had once embodied fashion and extravagance now prepared herself as simply as a servant. She tied her own ribbons, adjusted the hem, and smoothed the fabric as if she were readying not for death, but for a walk beneath the morning sun. When the guards entered, she greeted them softly, almost gently, her voice calm. Outside, the air smelled of rain and smoke. The streets of Paris were dense with people, some silent, others whispering, some with anger still sharp in their eyes. But many, as the cart passed, simply watched in silence. The Queen's face was pale but composed, her gaze steady and distant. She did not look downward or plead. She looked ahead, toward the horizon, as though she could see something no one else could. The journey through the city took hours. The wheels of the cart turned slowly, through streets lined with history, past shops, and churches past the river that had witnessed her triumphs in her fall. The crowd shifted like a living sea, and yet the moment felt strangely still. The noise seemed far away, muted, detached, as though the city itself held its breath. When they reached the Place de la Révolution, the sky was washed in gray. The wooden structure stood waiting, simple and stark against the morning light. Marie stepped down from the cart without help. Her foot caught briefly on the step, and she steadied herself, murmuring an apology to the executioner. A small act of grace that history would remember. There was no speech, no attempt to win the crowd. The silence that surrounded her was heavier than any words could bear. She turned her gaze upward once, perhaps toward the faint blue breaking through the clouds, and then placed her head upon the block. The sound that followed was brief, final, and absolute. A single heartbeat of history, closing. The crowd, for a moment, did not cheer. They simply stood, faces unreadable, as if unsure what they had expected to feel. The revolution continued its course, indifferent and unstoppable, but something in the air had shifted. Not triumph, not vengeance, but a quiet recognition of the human cost beneath the slogans. Her body was taken away, her name struck from ceremony, her titles erased. And yet, that morning, cold, gray, and unadorned, remained etched not in grandeur, but in the stillness of her composure. Marie Antoinette, the most watched woman of her age, left the world with the same fragile dignity she had found in her last nights. Not as a queen, but as a person who met the end with her eyes open. For a time, Paris tried to forget her. The city that had once shouted her name in fury turned its attention to new enemies, new betrayals, new trials. The revolution devoured its own children, and the roar that had once demanded justice became a quieter, darker hum. But even in that fever of change, her absence lingered like perfume after a candle has gone out. Faint, inescapable, and strangely human. The place where she had died became just another square. People crossed it on their way to work, to market, to war. The scaffold was gone, the wood reused, the blood washed away by rain. Yet the silence that followed her death did not vanish. It seeped into the stones, into the air itself. There were those who claimed to hear her name, whispered by the wind that moved through the empty boulevards at night. Perhaps it was imagination, or perhaps memory has a way of speaking even when history refuses to listen. In Austria, her family mourned her with quiet ceremony. The Empress Est, daughter who had once been married to a king, was now a ghost in letters. Her portrait turned to the wall. Her children's names were written carefully into prayers. And her few surviving possessions, a lock of hair, a rosary, a piece of lace, were kept like sacred relics. Across the Europa, her story began to shift from accusation to sorrow, from symbol to person. Writers and poets began to reimagine her, each in their own way. Some painted her as a martyr, others as a tragic fool. A woman crushed beneath the weight of her time. Painters softened her features. Composers wrote elegies in her name. Even those who had hated her found themselves drawn to the strange tenderness of her fall. History, relentless as it is, could not quite let her go. Versailles, too, could not escape her echo. The halls that had once glittered with life became hushed and hollow. Tourists, in later centuries, would walk through those rooms and swear they could feel a presence. Not haunting, but wistful, a sigh caught in the curtains, a trace of laughter beneath the dust. The palace remained magnificent, but the grandeur no longer seemed triumphant. It had become a monument to impress. In the end, Marie Antoinette survived not through monuments or titles, but through the quiet persistence of empathy. Her story was retold again and again, reshaped by each generation to fit its own conscience. For some, she remained the careless queen who lost a crown. For others, she became the woman who faced death with unshakable calm. Centuries later, her name still carries both beauty and sorrow. And perhaps that is fitting for history. Like memory, rarely offers mercy. It turns people into echoes, and echoes into legends. Yet somewhere beneath all that, the real voice remains, gentle and human, whispering through time, a reminder that even the brightest lives end in silence, and that silence, in its own way, still speaks. If you walk through Versailles today, you can still hear her, not in words, but in the hush that settles between footsteps, in the faint rustle of silk, imagined behind closed doors. The mirrors gleam as they always have, but their reflections are softer now, not of kings and queens, but of curious travelers, dreamers, and those who come searching for something they cannot quite name. The palace is immaculate, its marble floors polished, its chandeliers sparkling above endless rooms. Yet beneath the perfection, there is a quiet melancholy. The air carries the memory of a world that believed it could last forever. The gardens bloom each spring as if nothing had ever changed. But if you pause beside the fountains and listen, the water seems to whisper of laughter that once filled those paths, of voices that will never return. Marie Antoinette's little retreat, the Petit Trianon, remains perhaps the most haunting. There, the illusion of simplicity she once sought still lingers. The cottages, the still pond, the white curtains moving gently in the breeze. It feels peaceful, but also fragile, as though the world she tried to build for herself, small, human, removed from the weight of ceremony, still exists just at the edge of waking. People often asked what her story means. Was she vain, foolish, cruel, or simply caught in a current too vast to escape? The truth may be simpler. She was a woman born into a role, shaped by it, trapped by it, and finally freed only by its collapse. The lessons history offers are rarely gentle, yet her final grace. The calm she carried into the end remains a quiet defiance against cruelty and noise. Every empire leaves behind its ruins, but not all ruins are made of stone. Some live in memory, in art, in the faint echo of footsteps. Down a gilded corridor, Versailles endures, but it no longer belongs to monarchy. It belongs to the silence. To those who wander through it and wonder what it felt like to live beneath the weight of so much beauty and expectation. So if you ever find yourself there, walking through those long halls as the afternoon light fades and the tourist voices fade to murmurs, stop for a moment, look at the mirrors, the gold, the sky beyond the windows, and think of her. Not the queen, not the myth, but the woman who once stood here, looking at that same light, unaware that her reflection would outlast her. History has moved on, but some stories do not end. They linger quietly, reshaping themselves with each retelling. In the stillness of Versailles, in the hush before night falls, her presence remains, gentle, distant, and eternal. And perhaps that is what endures, most of all. Not the crown, not the court, but the echo of a human heart, still beating softly within the memory of stone. And so, dear listener, the candles of Versailles grow dim once more. The marble cools, the mirrors fade back into shadow, and the last echo of footsteps disappears into silence. Tonight, we have wandered through halls of light and sorrow, through the stillness of a woman whose name became larger than her life. Marie Antoinette, daughter, mother, queen, prisoner, leaves us now, not in tragedy, but in peace. There is something quietly human in her story. History often remembers her as a symbol of arrogance, of beauty, of downfall. But if you listen closely, beneath the noise of politics and the weight of judgment, there is a heartbeat. It is steady, unadorned, profoundly familiar. It reminds us that behind every legend there is a person who once breathed, hoped, and feared the way we all do. Perhaps that is why her voice endures, not in speeches or monuments, but in the soft persistence of memory, in the sigh of a curtain, the gleam of candlelight, the hush of a room that still seems to wait for her return. The past does not disappear. It only sleeps, waiting for someone curious enough to wake it. So, as you rest now, let the palace sleep again. Let its stories settle like dust on gold, untouched, unhurried. The night belongs to them and to you. Breathe deeply and let your thoughts drift far from the noise of the present, back into that gentle world where time slows and history whispers. If this quiet journey has brought you calm, I invite you to stay for the next one. Subscribe, share where you're listening from, or simply return another night when you need peace. Here, history will always wait for you, softly, patiently, faithfully. Now close your eyes. The candles are out, the halls are still, and the story is asleep. Let yourself rest, just as the palace does, in silence, in memory, and in dreams.